Thank you. Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Syed Ghazi. I work for a management consultancy, hopefully not the same one that was responsible for the street weather weather thing. I Accenture. Thank God.
Dan says you're cool.
I what I do is not sort of traditional management consultancy. We see a lot of our traditional big corporate clients concerned about the onslaught from big tech as well as small startups eating their value chain, and this talk of digital transformation. So my job is essentially to help them build new businesses and make them move a little faster, which, to be honest, we haven't been really successful at, and there are a few reasons for that. So if we take digital transformation, for example, last year $1.3 trillion was spent on digital transformation initiatives. 70% of those failed to reach their own stated goals. So that's a $900 billion black hole of failed projects. The response is we need more technology, we need more process, let's do another op model redesign. But when you look at the reasons, they're almost all of them are very human ones. They're like knowledge silos, there's problems with incentivization, decision making is optimized for regret minimization, blame avoidance, rather than delivering growth and value. So hence why I'm interested in this discussion on the future of human organizations. The other thing that I want to mention is that there are some structural concerns as well in how these organizations are structured. So normally when you try to do something new, it starts with a strategy meeting, which is usually people from a very specific demographic sitting in a room surrounded by post-its coming up with a strategy for the next 5, 10, 15 years. Then they'll come up with a few ideas that support that strategy. They'll minimize them to like 3 or 5. It's always 3 or 5, not sure why. And then they'll go back to the rest of the organization, say, this is the strategy we've come up with, this is the idea, and then they'll look for people to take those ideas forward. The problem with that is you don't know if the people are incompetent, if the idea is bad, or the strategy is inherently flawed when you've already invested so much social capital into it. When we look at like how innovation or new businesses that are successful are built, it's the exact opposite model. They start with the people, and then they go to the idea, and then the last thing is the strategy because it's an emergent strategy. That's it.
Okay, thank you. All right, I'm John Chinakopoulos. I've been coming to Santa Fe for 30 years. Even longer, I think, than you, Jeffrey, possibly.
What's 30? That's it.
89.
2019.
89.
9 minus 0 is 9.
Too difficult, okay. Anyway, so I teach economics at Yale, and I helped start a mortgage hedge fund 25 years ago. That's still going. So everybody else has managed to improve their talk, even making it even better than it was yesterday, talking about different things. I'm just going to double down and say the same thing that I said yesterday, which is that there are 5 problems in economics that I think will probably get resolved in some way, or at least addressed in the next 80 years. The problem and that are currently vexing and angering the population. 1 is large corporations, 2 is inequality, 3 is debt, 4th is congestion, and 5th is the environment. And they're all age-old problems, of course, but they've gotten worse lately because of information. And information, though, is going to be part of the solution, I think, and it's going to involve a different kind of tax used more extensively, a kind of tax that wasn't used so extensively before, one that improves incentives instead of the conventional income tax, which makes incentives worse. So large corporations, we all know that they're proliferating everywhere. Almost every industry is getting more concentrated. Just take doctors in New Haven. They all work for Yale's hospital now, and all over Connecticut. You take lawyers, accountants, supermarkets, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Uber. Big, 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 big. Now, the reason for a lot of this is increasing returns to scale. Economics, the heart of economics, 90% of economics at least, relies on the assumption of decreasing returns to scale. That eventually cuts off how big a company's going to be and makes for lots of competition. And that's what economics is always, the market economics has always relied on. Now we've got increasing returns to scale everywhere, apparently. Why did we get it? Well, the zero marginal cost of information transmission and communication, even transportation going very low. The rise of proliferation of networks. As we were just saying, if you add an extra node to a network, you're not just adding 10% more nodes and making 10% more output. It's everybody else on the network is all doing better, and the person joining is joining a bigger network, and so it goes up like the square instead of linearly, and so there's increasing returns to scale. And lots of government regulations, by the way, for example, in medicine, asking all the people who are getting on Medicaid and things like that, Medicare, there's so many forms you have to fill out that if you centralize it all, it makes it much easier on the doctors. That's a lot of why that kind of gains to scale is happening. Inequality, we all know about that. The top 1% getting richer and richer. Not just richer, but living longer, having better education, having spouses that live longer with better education, having children that live longer with better education. The world's angry, at least in America. So angry, in fact, that things like meritocracy now, it's a bad word instead of a good word. So how did this happen? Well, part of it is more global competition. That's how that hollowed out manufacturing, the middle class. Part of it is the information technology was a boon to capitalists and not to workers. But the majority of it comes inside the professions. Almost every profession is more unequally paid than it was before. We are in a winner-take-all economy more and more because it's, like I gave the example of my sister yesterday. She's an extraordinary pianist, one of the, top 100 pianists maybe in the world, but no one wants to hear her, and because they can hear the number 2 pianist in the world. And so this happens. It's happening in lots of different industries. There's much better sorting. You can find out who the best dry cleaners is in New Haven just by clicking on something. And why go to the third best dry cleaner? We can go to the best dry cleaner. Anyway, debt is another big problem. There are more Americans struggling with debt. Homeowners are struggling with debt. Students are struggling with debt. Cab drivers in New York, the medallions went up from the price of $100,000 to $1.7 million in the last 10 years, and they can't pay it back now. So cab drivers are overwhelmed with debt. So there's sovereign debt everywhere. There's what?
And then they crashed because of Uber.
And they crashed because of Uber. Although that's interesting that Uber is obviously bad news for them, but it's not as bad news as it sounds. They're not driving that much less. The cab drivers in New York, they're not making that many fewer rides than before. Yet the price of the asset went from 1.7 million to 100,000. So why did that happen? I'll come back to that in a second. So pensions, cities. Companies can't pay pensions, states can't pay pensions, cities have debts that they can't pay. Medicare, Social Security, these are debts that are almost unpayable. How did debts grow to be so big? Well, part of it is that the interest rates have kept coming down, not low enough to be zero so that the debts wouldn't be so bad. With interest, you pay more back than you borrowed, but mostly it's because of information technology. You can keep track of so many more debts. It's possible to make more debts because everybody can keep track of what's owed. That was not so easy 100 years ago. Okay, and anger has risen over the debts too. Now, what's the theory of what happens? Why is this such a problem, big debts? Because the debts don't just get written out of the blue. They're usually written in conjunction with purchasing something that's usually used as collateral. And the easier it is to borrow against that collateral, the more people will do it, and the higher the price of the collateral is going to go. You saw that with homes in the 2000s. You see it with tuition. The government makes it much easier to borrow to go to school, and tuitions went up. And you saw it with taxi cab medallions in New York City. Then something happens, like Uber gets created, that makes the lenders a little bit nervous. And they suddenly won't give such easy lending anymore. And so the new buyers, who can no longer get the easy lending but have to show up because the old buyers are constantly selling, and maybe are forced to sell by a margin call, the new buyers can't borrow as much and they can't pay as much, and that's why there's a collapse. So this is what I call the leverage cycle in 2000. It's this easy lending leading to high asset prices, and then a small shock creates changing lending environment, and that causes the asset to crash and leaves people very angry. The fourth problem is congestion. The whole state in the U.S. is, we started at 5F, the whole state is in the Connecticut, New Haven, New York corridor is completely cluttered. New York City is cluttered. Many of the biggest cities in the world are cluttered. London is cluttered with too much traffic. There's congestion everywhere. So I'm going to come back to, so that's another problem. It's, Jeffrey says that people adapt to it. What he means is that they put up with a 2-hour commute. That may be adapting to it, but it's not solving the problem. And then we've got the problem of global warming. So these are 5 problems that we need to solve. And I'm going to suggest that information, which, as I tried to argue, caused many of the problems, can be used as a solution. In the next 80 years, we're going to have an incredible amount of information. Anytime you make a contract, you do it because it's got to be enforced by a court, so there has to be a record of it. Well, those records are going to be much more easily available. The whole thing, it'll be completely clear, maybe to many private agencies, but probably also to the government, what all the transactions are, what everybody's income really is, what activities they're doing. And with all this information, it'll be possible to do social engineering in a more coherent way than we've been able to do now. So, to start with congestion, the most obvious one, I think it's inevitable. It's not just a good thing. I'm trying to argue it's inevitable that these big cities and the areas around them are going to get so congested, and it's so slow to build new roads, and the number of cars keeps increasing. The only way to solve the problem is to tax them. And once you have the data of who's traveling when and at what times, you can make time-dependent taxes, and you can compute through simulated models, knowing all this information, how much each person is contributing to the problem. And so you can have taxes that aren't arbitrarily set, but are set according to the congestion that you cause when you take the road at that time. So there'll be real-time pricing. You'll click on your phone, and it'll tell you if you want to go from here to there, and you take this route, that'll cost you $4.95. If you take that other route, it'll be $3.50. If you take that route, it'll be $12, and you'll be able to decide which one to take. And every day, it'll probably be the same price, so you'll be able to make a reasonably coherent decision. It won't be that hard to decide. In fact, the prices will tell you a lot. It'll tell you how long it'll take. So similarly, we're going to have to do something about debt. Once you have all this information about contracts, you'll know what the debts are on the medallions. You'll know how much people are borrowing. You'll realize that the medallion price is going up because people are getting such easy loans. And then the government can intervene and prevent leverage. That's the loan to value. That's the crucial variable to work with. The central banks have worked with the interest rate for 100 years, and they haven't been paying enough attention to the loan to value. And once they pay attention to the terms of the deal, not just the interest rate, but the terms like the loan to value, and start regulating that, we'll have much better, safer credit markets, and they'll have the information to actually implement that. So with all these taxes, of course, you're going to have a redistribution of income, but you're also going to know much more about people's income. So it'll be much easier to have income transfers, a negative income tax, I called it, to redress income inequalities. And we're going to have to do much more about inequality. We're going to have child care training from infancy and large inheritance taxes, but a lot of it is going to become easier once people are paying the true cost for the things that they do. Finally, the bigness. What can we do about bigness? Well, theory is way behind practice now. As I said, 90% of economics is decreasing returns to scale, and now the big problem is increasing returns to scale. We don't have much theory, so there's not much guidance about what we should do. So the two most obvious lessons are, when you've got decreasing returns to scale, and it's just better for everyone to be bigger and bigger because it gets cheaper, that gives so much power to the monopoly that it has to be regulated. So clearly all these companies like Facebook have to be regulated. Even the people running them say they want to be regulated. But the second lesson of economics is that if you get to a point where there's really the increase in returns to scale has turned into just constant returns to scale, like many platforms, maybe each platform, the bigger it is, the better, but when you multiply platforms, different ways of communicating with the same people, maybe that's just constant returns to scale. And at that point, there's no reason in having the same company own all the different platforms. they could be split up that way. So I think that this is one of the great future, and this will be a short-term 10-year thing. Over the next 10 years, economics has to work out what to do about increasing returns to scale and make that a central problem and not the side problem it's been until recently.
Thank you.
Jeffrey?
Very good.
I shudder when you exactly.
No, it was better than yesterday. Even though it was the same. Even though it was the same. I was charged with talking about yesterday the future of cities and urbanization, and much of what I had to say and have to say today relates, I think, quite a lot to what was said, first of all, in John's talk, but to some of the talks earlier today. And so let me put it in context first and remind you of a few things, and I'm also going to repeat many of the things that I said yesterday. So the first is that the future of the planet in terms of human beings living the kind of socioeconomic life we lead is completely entwined with the future of cities, because we are urbanized creatures. I'm sure most of you know that the world became more than half urbanized just a few years ago. Now more than 50% of the people on the planet live in urban areas. We are urbanizing at the extraordinary rate of approximately 1.5 million people every week, which is equivalent to a New York metropolitan area every 2 months, or a city of Boston just over the river every 4 days, or a country the size of Denmark every month. That's what's happening. So that is extraordinary. And just a comment to a question this morning about looking for metrics for things that are going to happen. If this were a physical system, if this were a physics system, like a liquid or a solid, and we saw something like that happening, we know what's going to happen. It's going to go through a major transition, a major phase transition. That's the metric. The metric, not just exponential, this is faster than exponential. So that's just a comment to our developing metrics of change. And we can explore that maybe in the discussion. But so this is an extraordinary phenomenon, and that behooves us, I think, to think very seriously about trying to develop a science of cities, because connecting it with the conversation earlier today, people have been thinking about cities since, for 2,500 years, writing about them, theorizing about them, but all of it is very much in a narrative style. It's very qualitative, and what I said earlier, most urban development, most architecture actually is, to some extent, rules of thumb. It's rarely based on science, amazingly, so that we end up with cities that have been built ab initio, like Brasilia, Islamabad, Canberra, Washington, and so on, have all been failures as cities. It takes them a very long time before they become real cities. That's because we didn't understand cities. So one of the things that I think is important, not just for the sake of city, but the sake of the long-term future of the planet, is to really understand cities. And I think that has become a realization especially in the last 10 years or so. More and more people are turning their attention to this. And the question is, can we make that into a serious science in the sense that was discussed earlier? I used the word quantitative, but analytic, based on, and this is most important, are there principles that transcend the kinds of extraordinary regularities that we see in the structure of cities? And one of those regularities is what John just referred to, is that cities are a great expression of increasing returns to scale. The bigger you are, every socioeconomic activity of a city increases in a systematic, regular fashion. Double the size of the city, everything socioeconomic increases by approximately 15%, whether it's good, bad, or ugly, wages, AIDS cases, etc., and so on, crime, and so forth. There's only one thing that actually violates that in terms of socioeconomic activity, and that is diversity. Diversity has the extraordinary property, diversity meaning kinds of jobs, businesses, that increases exponentially. So a tiny change in the diversity of city, you increase a certain sector, business sector, you have a huge effect on the GDP. This is, in terms of thinking ahead, this has become urgent because, not just because of these numbers I gave you, but just putting in the sense of the definition of what our urban life is and the kinds of problems that John described, in particular the question of congestion, but something that I think is much more important than that actually, and is associated with that. And it comes out actually, first of all, of the theory underlying this, because one of the things that was emphasized earlier, it's all very well trying to get the systematic behavior of these systems, but to get a theory for why it is so, and that all is related to what cities really are. First of all, they're the most extraordinary machine that has been developed by human beings in order to facilitate interaction. So cities are fundamentally social networks and infrastructural networks, and the interface and integration of those. And so looking into the future, the question is, if we have a theory of those, which can explain these increasing returns to scale, as well as the economies of scale, can we also understand where that growth comes from? And the answer is yes. But the question then is, can we understand what's going to end up stopping that growth? Because it can't go on forever. That's, I mean, that might be a very primitive form of Malthusian argument, but, and that's a big question mark, actually. So can we imagine, if we look 70, 80 years ahead, and many people have thought about this, that John talked about New Haven to New York, but maybe the city, the real concept of a city might be that it's something that stretches from Washington, D.C. or Baltimore all the way up to Boston. That's one conurbation, one area, and that starts to challenge the concept of what living on the planet is for a human being in terms of these huge agglomerations, and whether, you know, this is a new phenomenon. So that's a very deep question. After all, we have made one truly major decision, major transition as human beings in the past. We went from living as hunter-gatherers for an extraordinarily long period of time, and then beginning about 10,000 years ago with the discovery of language, and that gets into this question that David brought up about intelligence and the use of our intelligence. We transitioned into urban creatures in one form or another, forming collective behavior and so forth. And the question is there an end to that, or is there a transition into a different kind of institution, organization of human life? So the question of the future of a city, what is the future of megacities, of gigacities? First of all, this concept of something that's in the Pearl River Basin in China, or on the east coast of the United States, that kind of image, or the images occurring in Africa. Lagos may be 100 million by the time some of you are my age. So I think those are very extremely important issues, because all of the problems that John was talking about from this viewpoint are actually have their origin in this urbanization phenomenon, which has its deeper origin in the physics, mathematics, geometry even, of urban and urban networks, meaning both social networks, what we're doing now, and the infrastructural networks, meaning how you're going to get home tonight, so to speak, and where you're going to live. So one of the things that's going to help that in the future is unquestionably the extraordinary amount of data and the idea of smart cities. That will no doubt be extremely important, but it's also very misleading for many of the reasons that were discussed earlier. I think just gathering data and thinking of data as democratic and egalitarian is completely idiotic, and we need to have conceptual frameworks, we need to have theory, we need to have big ideas. So one of my mantras is big data needs big theory, and big theory needs big ideas. This brings us to the central role, or the central issue, maybe, and that is the whole question of the future of the planet in terms of what's happening in terms of our cities and social structures. And in that regard, and indeed in terms of our institutions, and something I just want to mention, I think should be discussed here, and that is we have this, something I just described, which is the potential evolution of the concept of city, if we think in the 80, 100 years time scale. But I think we also need to think concomitantly with that, something that was touched upon earlier, and that is the evolving concept of a company or a corporation, and you even touched on it with your idea of a large company, and that is the role of the transition of companies from, which probably never totally existed, of being part of the capitalist system and profits being the total motivation for why a company exists. I mean, it's something that, of course, is to make transitions within society, but to the idea of social responsibility. The companies are part of the social fabric of our lives and need to play an integral role in that. And similarly, the other major institutions that are going through transition and need to go through transitions are the educational system, and in particular, the role of universities. That could we imagine that as cities change, Harvard won't be Harvard anymore. It'll be something else. It'll be some other structure maybe. But we need to have these, but I think we need to also discuss the changes that would take place in universities, since universities are, everybody in this room, I suspect, has been to a university, so that plays a critical, pivotal role. And finally, in terms of this question of long-term future, and some of the things we discussed earlier, about 10 years, 12 years ago, there was a meeting that I was privileged to be invited to that was, it was a Nobel symposium. The host was Angela Merkel, so it was held in Potsdam. And it was on many of the questions that come up here. And I was asked to give a talk in that, and I whimsically suggested something, a phrase that almost turned up in the first talk this morning, or one of the first talks that Chris talked about in terms of life, but that is that we need a sort of grand unified theory. I called it then of sustainability, not a phrase I particularly like, but we do need to start thinking, not doing all the things that we do in terms of thinking of the future of the planet, but doing it in an integrated way. And I called then for a kind of $100 billion, $100 trillion international project that would bring all of this together so that we all start thinking about it, everything from people not just across disciplines in academia, but people, practitioners, finance people, politicians, and so on, that we all participate in this together. And the idea that it should be thought of with the same sense of urgency that it is 1943 and the Nazis are taking over and we better develop an atom bomb, or the other analog, of course, is the Apollo program that was felt urgent for different reasons by President Kennedy. But we need that, and may I say that from my viewpoint, the threats of 1943 at that time are small on the scale of the threats that we now face. I mean, that was a local threat in some ways. This is a global threat, and categorically can change the planet. And so I just want to finish off one other thing that I want to go back to. The increasing returns that dominate cities and dominate our economy have built into them, I believe, their own destruction. Because the one thing that they do is they do the thing that's really causing the anger, I believe is causing the anger and anxiety, and that is it increases the pace of life. Life is getting faster and faster. It has systematically, quantitatively, and almost predictably become faster and faster. And a fundamental question is, can we continually adapt to it? Because we're the same human beings that we were when we started all this 10,000 years ago, or even 100,000 years ago. We have the same brains, the same bodies, but we're asked to do something that is extraordinarily more complex, I believe. And the wonder is that we're able to do it. And one of the real questions is there a threshold on that? Is there an end to that? I mean, can we or can we not? No one knows the answer to that, I certainly don't. But I have a non-scientific intuition that we're fast approaching that, and part of the reason for the anger and anxiety is, despite the increasing standard and quality of life that everybody has had, we're getting angrier and more anxious, and we're electing people like Trump. And we're tolerating autocratic rule everywhere from China to Poland. Finish.
Thank you, Jeffrey. David.
It's always a rather fun exercise to follow Jeff on a podium. Let's see. John talked about a relationship going back with the SFI. I was actually at the second summer school, and I was a postdoc way back in the day before I headed off to a machine learning startup, and then IBM and NASA and Stanford, and came back home. But anyway, unlike John and Jeff, I will actually talk about something different, because this panel is supposed to be on social organization, and I didn't really talk about anything related to that yesterday. This does connect up a bit with what Jeff said, a little bit what John said, and actually a lot with what Jessica said this morning, and even a bit about Dan. We've been talking about things like social networks. Social networks, they're, what is it now, 10, 15 years old, that they've been a major part of the scientific discourse. And the ones that most people have been paying attention to have been freeform social networks, unstructured, kind of like what you might find as, well, if Jen were to ever find a pristine ecosystem. This is just how they interact when just sort of left to themselves without any attempts to do something like Jessica's social engineering. There is, though, another form of social system, which was briefly mentioned here, which is much more structured social organizations. In economics, it's called firms. Similar creatures are governmental institutions. And there's actually been extraordinarily little work done on these kinds of things. So first, a little bit of the, in essence, the way that firms are actually managed, as opposed to, there is some theory which I'll mention in a bit. But the way they're actually managed, if you look back in the historical record, it's about half a millennium old that sort of the major parts of the modern firm existed. If you talk about governmental institutions, you can go back to say, you can go back to say Achaemenid Persia or Han Dynasty, and that's pretty much a large part of the current governmental bureaucratic structure was already in place. Arguably, you could actually go back even further to the Akkadians, which would be the first large nation-state kind of a system. And ever since then, there's been essentially, we're using the same structures. Jeff was talking a little bit more about just rules of thumb. We are in essence doing that in terms of how we're organizing this meeting. This meeting was not put together by somebody looking at even, this is talking about agent-based models or this, that, the other, to try to have here is the way that I should actually structure this meeting in such a way that according to this quantitative science, the best outcome will come out with the greatest likelihood. We're quite sure.
Feels like science to me, David, but I'll let that
a lot of that, but for example, the way that we were talking about the social network interventions there, the other kinds of social networks, never mind the social